In this video, I'm going to tell you why I switched to mainly using solid state amps instead of tube amplifiers. I've used both over the years. I've owned many tube amps and solid state amps. There's been times where I've sold my tube amps and only had solid state amps and vice versa, but now I'm done. I'm mainly using solid state amps. I've got one tube amp, which I rarely use, and to be honest, for most of the professional playing and teaching that I do as a jazz guitar player, I would prefer to use a solid state amp. Hi everybody, Jamie Holroyd here helping you learn jazz guitar. Welcome to the channel. If you're new here and you want to get started playing jazz guitar, then please check out my free beginner jazz guitar ebook. So a bit about me. I initially began playing guitar as a blues guitar player, and when I was first learning guitar, everyone always used to say that tube amps were better. Of course, I'm going back here about 15 years ago, and solid state amps are not quite as good as what they are now. So that was always the verdict, that you should just go and get a tube amp. And when I was playing blues, that was the main type of amp that I used. I then got into jazz and I was using tube amps for a while. Then I got into solid state, and then it was kind of both going on for a while. But now solid state seems to be the way in which I'm going for teaching and gigging, and I'm going to explain why in this video. I'm not alone in this. I was researching this on the web, and over at jazzguitar.b there was a poll asking guitar players if they prefer solid state or tube amps, and as you can see here, most jazz guitar players do tend to prefer solid state amps. So let's try and figure out why that is. The first reason why most jazz guitar players prefer to use solid state amps is that you tend to get more clean headroom in a smaller and lighter package. So if you take a few common tube amps, maybe something like a Fender Blues Junior, a Fender Pro Junior, and a Peavey Classic 30, those are not exactly light amps, but they will break up if you have to play with a loud drummer or in a loud band. They might sound great if you're playing at low volumes, but any type of louder situation that you've got to be in, then it definitely is risky taking one of those amps to a gig. If you compare that to the solid state line of amps around that kind of price range and that kind of size range, then you've got things like a Roland Microcube. That's one option. You have things like Henriksen amps, Polytone amps on the used markets. They're just three examples of solid state amps which are going to stay clean all day long. So I have a bit of a personal horror story when it comes to this. So a couple of years ago, I got asked to play a jazz gig with some really great musicians, and there was a particular loud drummer on this gig, and I played the gig. I took my Telecaster with me and I took a Pro Junior, and literally by the third song, the Pro Junior was distorting already. And this is not like Motorhead levels of volume, you know, but this is loud, and it's not just like a quiet jazz drummer playing with brushes. He was using sticks and everything else, and by the third song the amp was already distorting. Luckily there was a Polytone to hand, and this was a Polytone Mega Brew, and which is much smaller and much lighter than a Fender Pro Junior, and with that I had much more clean headroom and a much better tone for the gig than my heavy tube amp. So that was, you know, one pivotal moment for me when I thought, why am I carrying this thing around when it's not even loud enough to play a standard jazz gig? So usually in most amps you do get more headroom in a lighter package. Obviously if you've got something like a twin, you're going to have headroom all day long, but realistically most jazz guitar players don't want to lug around a big amp. Another reason why I prefer using solid state to tube amps is that I find solid states to have a more consistent sound. Obviously by their very nature, valve amps sound different once they've warmed up, they sound different once the tubes start wearing out, and they really react differently to how you play, which can be a great thing if you're playing blues or something like that. This could be an entirely different story, but as a jazz guitar player, we get most of our sound from how we hit the strings and how we set the guitar. Personally speaking, I just want a reliable, consistent, warm sound, and I find that often easier to get with a solid state amplifier. The final reason why I prefer using solid state amps is their maintenance and reliability. Obviously tube amps need their tubes replacing depending on how often you use it, and I generally find that they need servicing more, and they, in my experience, have been less reliable than solid state amps. Beyond that, if I'm practicing or doing some teaching or even some recording at home, tube amps always seem to be slightly noisy. There always seems to be some kind of hiss or shush or something like that. With solid state amps, that tends to be less of the case. I'm not saying that no matter what guitar you plug into a solid state amp, it's going to be quiet in any room, but generally speaking, especially if I'm recording or teaching, I don't want any noise from an amp. I want the amp to be as quiet as it can be, and I find that I do get that with a solid state. And generally, I've used solid states on lots and lots of gigs over the years. I never need to get them serviced or anything, they just keep on working forever. Whereas at the back of my mind, if I'm taking a tube amp, you know, I'm thinking, okay, do I need to take a small solid state amp as a backup as well? To keep things balanced, I should probably give you a few reasons why I like tube amps. As I said at the beginning of the video, I do own one, and despite the horror story which I shared earlier in the video, I have used tube amps on gigs successfully and in the recording studio successfully as well. So why do I like them? Well, for me, the sound is different. They sound different from the standard jazz amps which are on the market. If you compare the sound of a tube amp to a Polytone or a Henriksen, Polytone or Henriksens are very dark coloured amps, right? You can plug a Strat or a Telecaster into a Polytone or a Henriksen and they sound like jazz guitars, where obviously if you plug the same guitar into like a Twin or something like that, it still very much sounds like a Fender. Obviously you can tweak how you play and you can tweak the guitar controls and all sorts of things to get a jazzier sound, but literally as soon as you plug a Fender into a jazz amp, it sounds much, much darker. So you're never going to get that kind of natural sound on a jazz amp like you are with a tube amp. Beyond that, to me, they feel differently. When you play notes and when you dig into notes on a tube amp, it reacts different and it feels different, and it will make you play maybe slightly differently from what a tube amp will. Sound-wise, there's a lot of debate about that. Obviously, tube amplifier modelling has come on a long way in the last 20 years, and you can get fantastic amp simulators, and I've certainly used those before and I've been really happy with my sound. So I don't think that the sound is as night and day as it used to be. For me, it's just simply the feeling of using a tube amp and how the notes react differently when you've got tubes that are powering the sound, you know. If you've never played any of these amps before and you're looking at getting a jazz amp, I really can't emphasize that you have to try these amps in person to see, hear and feel. Over video, I mean, there's so much that can factor into how you would judge an amp on a video, and there really is nothing like judging the sound of an amp with your own ears in person and with your own playing. Another reason why you might prefer to use a tube amp is if you're going for an early jazz guitar sound. If you want a sound that is going to break up slightly, like maybe a Charlie Christian tone or an Oscar Moore tone, one of those guys from the 1930s or 40s, then a tube amp might be the way to go. So, what is my favourite kind of solid state jazz amp? Well, for me personally, I really like Polytones. Over the years, I've owned many different solid state jazz amps, Henriksens, ZTs, Rolands, Peavies, all of which have their own pros and cons, which you really need to experience for yourself. But despite owning all those amplifiers and using them at gigs and things like that, the Polytone has always stayed in my collection. The model which I currently have is called the Polytone Mega Brute, and the reason why I like this is that when you compare it to the bigger Polytone models, it actually has a more transparent, clearer sound. I find that the Polytones with the 10 and 12-inch speakers, for me personally, sound a little bit too dark and too muddy, whereas the 8-inch speaker is a weird thing to talk about because in other amps it can sound really boxy and not great at all, but in this particular Polytone amp, to me, it sounds and works fantastic. To give you an idea of this sound and why I like it, here is a clip of the US jazz guitar player Howard Alden. You can see that he's using a Polytone Mega Brute in this clip with an arch top, and the tone is fantastic. Another great American jazz guitar player who sometimes uses a Polytone Mega Brute is Clint Strong. Here is a short clip of Clint playing. He's actually using a Parker Fly guitar plugged into a Polytone Mega Brute here to give you an idea of the sound again. So those are the reasons why, as a jazz guitar player, I personally gravitate towards solid state amplifiers for most of my playing, recording and teaching. It's highly subjective, there's good reasons for using both, but what I'd like to know is, which amp do you prefer? Do you prefer solid states, tubes? Maybe, like Joe Pass later in his career, you don't prefer using an amp at all. Maybe you plug directly into an audio interface, maybe you plug into a PA system. Please share your thoughts in the comment section. I'd love to know what you guys think. If you enjoyed this video and you found it useful, please click the like button. And if you'd like more content like this, then please click the subscribe button.